As a product of the mechanical age, trains created a greater mobility for man. With a train, he could transport great weights across vast distances and rugged terrains with a minimum expenditure of human energy. Unless, of course, you happen to be a convict working on the Port Arthur line in Van Diemen's Land. Constructed in 1836 under the supervision of Captain O'Hara Booth, the line ran for 7 kilometres across the Tasman Peninsula, connecting Norfolk Bay to Port Arthur. The line was novel in that it was constructed entirely of wood and was powered by convicts. In the historical novel For the Term of His Natural Life, Marcus Clarke describes the railway as being
composed of a number of low wagons pushed and dragged up the steep incline by convicts who drew themselves up in the wagons when the trucks dashed down the slopes and acted as drags.
Each rough wooden wagon was capable of carrying up to 1 ton in weight and was propelled by 4 convicts. The convicts were chosen, ironically, for their honesty, as the temptation to abscond to freedom was ever present. While the railway initially decreased labour costs, it could not sustain maintenance costs or compete with steamship efficiency. In 1858, the line was finally closed, having established itself in history as Australia's first railway. The first steel-railed, steam-driven railway to be built in Tasmania was the Western Line. It ran from Launceston to Deloraine and covered 72 kilometres. The need for the line was brought about by the great urgency that farmers and pastoralists had to get their perishables to market. Under normal wet weather conditions, which lasted up to 9 months of the year, it would take a bullock dray 2 days to cover 24 kilometres. In September of 1863, a railway committee of influential citizens was formed. They petitioned the Tasmanian Parliament for permission to raise the necessary capital for a railway. As their champion, the committee had Sir Richard Dry, first Speaker of the House of Assembly. So it wasn't unexpected that the decision to build was granted parliamentary approval after he became Tasmania's next Premier. The tender for construction went to Overend and Robb, a Melbourne-based firm of engineers, for the sizable amount of £200,671, 8 shillings and 8 pence. This included the first 8 months' maintenance. On August 21st, 1868, work began with a vengeance on the state's first steam railway line. 200 aspiring local workers were hired, along with 500 navvies imported from Victoria. As work progressed, ill feeling arose between the two camps as local labour was dismissed for trifling reasons and preference was given to employing the experienced Victorian navvies. One of the problems that the engineers had to contend with was gorges and rivers, geographic hurdles that were surmounted by building viaducts and bridges. The first viaduct to be built was at Hunter's Mill. Consisting of 4 semicircular spans, this viaduct carried the line 13.5 metres above the ground and used 800,000 bricks in its construction. At Longford, a straight 5-arched viaduct led right onto a solid metal bridge crossing the South Esk River. The bridge was constructed in 2 spans, each of 60 metres in length. Most of the components were cast and pre-drilled in England, then assembled on site, using what was then a new engineering technique known as riveting. To this day, the bridge stands as testimony to engineering and labour skills that are no longer used. A first ride-on-rail excursion was inaugurated on the 19th of August, 1869. The day was declared a holiday for Launceston, and 4,000 people are reported to have ridden the 7.2 kilometres of rail on the day. Ladies were confined to the 4th of the 8 trucks, while men occupied the rest. The day's excursion brought much excitement for all those on board. As useful as the railway was, it eventually ran at a loss, causing the government to acquire the company. Because of an agreement, the government was able to collect a levy from the landowners whose properties adjoined the line to make good any losses. But people refused to pay. Bailiffs were ordered to seize property of defaulters and sell it to pay the levy.
At the auction of the seized goods, 6 men dressed as undertakers walked into the ales room carrying an empty coffin. On the lid lay an axe. It was pointed out in no uncertain terms that the first person to bid would have his head removed and be carried away in the coffin. Needless to say, no sales occurred that day.
The seizure of assets led to a state of anarchy in Launceston. 35 Hobart police armed with carbines were drafted in to restore law and order. Some 32 years later, the saga of the Launceston and Western Railway Company finally came to a close. The company was liquidated with all assets being sold to the government, thus ending a contentious era in Tasmania's early rail history. While the Western Line was being built in the north of the state, the south was evolving its own grandiose scheme. Not wishing to be upstaged by the impudent northerners, the south concocted a rail scheme that would connect the capital, Hobart, with Launceston, the chief provincial centre. Since the line was to run through the centre of the island, it was to be called the Tasmanian Main Line Company. After many public meetings and much parliamentary debate, the work was awarded to Messrs. Edwin Clark, Punchard and Company of London. The great difficulty associated with this line was to find a route across the ridges of the Midlands, whose peaks ranged up to 600 metres. A number of routes were surveyed, giving cause for communities along the surveyed routes to politic fiercely for the line to pass through their area. The route eventually chosen was the one that skillfully avoided building expensive tunnels through the mountain terrain. In fact, only one tunnel was found to be necessary on the whole line, and that was at Rindeston. It was a little over 1 kilometre in length. In keeping with the austere nature of the project, the frugal 3-foot 6-inch gauge was adopted as opposed to the more opulent 5-foot 3-inch gauge. Work on the line began early in 1873. To supplement the local workforce, 1,500 skilled men were brought out from England at a contracted rate that was less than local rates. After much bickering between the contractors and the government, the line was completed, with the first train running from Hobart to Launceston on the 1st of November 1876. In later years, deviation lines were built from outlying areas to the main line to serve the needs of the farming community. As a passenger on the main line, you would have met a certain personality by the name of Mrs. Delaney. She was noted for her mercurial wit and ribald stories, and the apples that she sold to passengers. She would sell her apples to the very last moment, then jump from the train. One day, she misjudged her timing, lost her grip, and was killed under the train, so bringing to an end another of the eccentric characters that enriched rail life. As a conduit between the north and south, the line fulfilled its role admirably. Unfortunately, rising overheads caused there to be little or no profits. This economic state of affairs caused the simmering mistrust that existed between the English company and the government to flare up and manifest itself in litigation. On the 1st of October 1890, the company passed into the possession of the government of the colony for the sum of £1,106,500, thereby bringing to an end 20 years of acrimony and mistrust between the two parties. The acquisition of the Tasmanian Main Line Railway Company placed the entire railway network under government control. Little did they realise, as they prepared themselves for a new chapter in Tasmania's history, that the colony was on the brink of a long and lasting depression.